So we come to the creation of my real self, and as Mary stated this morning, this session is about becoming my loving self. So the next 2 days we're looking at how to become my loving self. So to know what my loving self is, I've got to sort of understand a bit about my real self and how God created it. So this is the point of this particular discussion. The only problem with this discussion is that I could spend 30 hours on it and still not even scratch the surface of it. Right? And so 1 hour on it is, what's that going to do for me? Hardly anything at all, unfortunately. So I'm sure that at some point we're going to have to give you far more detail. But a part of the wonderful thing about the way God's created you is that you're going to be discovering your real self for the rest of your existence. So this is a very, very important thing to remember. That we can give you a brief summary of some of the things you will discover, but at the end of the day, it is a discovery process and a personal process that you're going to need to go through for yourselves. Okay, so the creation of my real self. Number one thing to remember. I am the pinnacle of God's creation. So we want to see, so the point of this section is really this, like what has God done to create my real self? And I am the pinnacle of God's creation. And most of you, I've said that many times before, right, to you. Most of you don't know what that means yet at all. Let me give you some examples of what it means. Your soul is more complex than the universe itself. And the only things that are almost just as complicated as your soul is the laws that govern it. Right? So the laws that govern it are a complex set of laws that eventually you'll discover as through your own engagement of the process of engaging and coming to know your real self, you'll eventually discover these things about yourself. That you are the most complicated being in the universe. Right? And that applies to us collectively and individually. Interesting thought, hey? That we actually are more complex than the universe itself. And in some ways you can see it if you examine the human body as a sort of as a sort of type or a what would you call it? There's a word for that, isn't there? But I can't remember it for the moment. This English language thing is getting me a bit. But it's like your physical body is like an example of the complexity of your soul in some ways, because your physical body is one of the most complex organisms physically, right? And in fact, of all the organisms that humankind examine, the human organism, the actual physical body, is still the least understood compared to the rest of the organisms that we examine. And you can see then if our human body is the least understood, then what about the spirit body? That must also be the least understood organism in the spirit world, right? And the reality is our soul, which governs those two bodies, is even more complicated again and complex again. So let's look at some basics about its complexity, and that's all we're really going to be able to do at this stage, right? But it's important for you to understand that as the pinnacle of God's creation, you are the most complex thing in the universe, and there's a whole set of complex laws that you can understand once you connect to your soul that govern the development and continuation and the very survival of the human soul. And not only its development and survival, but also its transformation. The human soul is the only organism that God has created that can be transformed from its current created condition into a divine condition. And there's a whole set of laws that govern the transformation of the human soul from the physical condition it's created in its first instance, and the transformation into the divine condition. And even involved in the potentiality of that occurring is an incredible potentiality that's been offered. So a very, very complicated and complex organism, the human soul.